Here.
How you doing?
Good morning. Thank you for coming out on this unexpected chilly morning. And thank you for being faithful every month coming out and supporting us and supporting our speakers. We appreciate you. So today,
look over here so they can see.
Today we have an amazing presenter. Margot and I had heard of Brandon Seale forever ago, and then we met him some years, like 2 years ago. We met him at a presentation, and so when we started San Antonio Mission Indian Descendants, we were like, we have to find a way to bring Brandon to be a speaker for us. And
the funny part is, like, I was trying to find them this whole time too. So
we were trying to find each other, and you know, it was like, how do we get a hold of him? Well, we went to a function, and lo and behold, there was Brandon. And so, you know, he was gracious enough when we said, we need you. He was like, okay. So we are so thankful that he is out with us today. I know that we've heard him speak before and make presentations before, so I know it's going to be amazing. So you guys take notes, sit back, relax, and hold on for the ride.
all right, thank you so much. Appreciate it. So thanks. Well, thank you everybody for coming. So I'll start with, so in January of 1790, the Spanish comandante of the basically northern New Spain, the interior provinces, surprised a group of a couple hundred Lipan and Mescalero Apaches about 80 miles west of here. It was in a canyon that today is in Uvalde, Texas, which takes its name from the name of that comandante. It was Juan de Ugalde, and that the name gets corrupted later into Uvalde. And it was a Spanish victory. They killed something like 59 of the Lipanes and 2 of the captains. They captured several hundred horses. And according to me, the first time I told the story in the first season of my podcast, and in fairness to myself, I was relying on contemporaries and other historians too. But according to me, that battle marked the end of the Lipan Apache people as a nation. They were a broken nation after that. The Lipan Apaches in particular have the curious distinction of being declared extinct more times and more inaccurately, probably, than any other group in Texas history. Because 3 months after this battle, at which they were supposedly broken, they go on a 6-month-long campaign throughout the Rio Grande Valley. They attacked Laredo, the Presidio del Rio Grande. They attacked the Villas del Norte down in the Rio Grande Valley. They killed 51 Spanish settlers. They captured 1,400 head of livestock. By the end of that same year, that supposedly victorious Spanish comandante has been fired. So has the Spanish governor of Texas, has been fired for provoking this unanswered display of Lipan power. By the end of the decade, the so-called broken Lipanes had entered into not just peace treaties with the city of San Antonio and the city of Laredo and the province of Nueva Vizcaya and the province of Nuevo Santander and the province of Nuevo León. They enter into what are called capitulations, capitulaciones, which are basically these centers of Spanish colonial power capitulating, acknowledging Apache hegemony and Apache authority over this region. And the way we know this is, are we chopping up over there? Anyway, what they commit to in these capitulaciones are to make gifts, to make annual payments of gifts to the Apaches. But gifts was just the way that the provincial administrators made themselves feel better about what they were actually doing. Is they were paying rent. They were paying rent to the overlords of the region. And so it continues like this too. You know, the supposedly broken Apaches in 1812, 1813, they're a critical player. I may try something here. You know, I feel like the size of our group here may permit me to just talk. We want to turn that one off, and we'll keep the Facebook one on, and then this may be less distracting. So, the supposedly broken Lipan Apaches, they forced these capitulations in 1798, 1799, 1800. In 1812, 1813, they played a critical role in the Battle of Medina on the side of the Texas independence movement. They played a critical role even after the Battle of Medina. Then they allied with the Comanches, basically to conduct a guerrilla campaign against Spanish authority for 10 years, and ultimately rid Texas once again of Spanish authority for Mexican independence in 1821. They become, the Lipan Apaches, the primary allies of the Republic of Texas against Comanches, against other native groups, against other Mexican centralist incursions. So in 1842, the Mexican army marches in and captures San Antonio twice, actually, in March and in September. And both times, you have the powers of Texas government fleeing Austin, basically abandoning the border, and you have the Lipan Apaches marching south through Refugio and all these other places. So they become these critical allies of the Republic of Texas power. I'll come back to that in a second. But we also should remember too that the Lipan Apaches, the last Lipan Apaches to go into a reservation are in 1904, which is 114 years after the Battle of Soledad Creek that I started with. It's 30 years after the Comanches are defeated and sent off to the reservation. It's 20 years after Geronimo. And those are not even the last Lipan Apaches. Lipan Apaches are documented as living in San Antonio well into, at least until 1937. They're documented is in the mountains of the Serranía del Burro in northern Coahuila into the 1950s. And even as late as 2008, a researcher documented a remnant, a residual group of the Lipan Apaches still in the Santa Rosa Mountains there in Coahuila. And so the question is, why is this temptation so powerful to want to declare, especially the Lipan Apaches, but really it applies to most Texas Indian groups? Why is the impulse so strong to want to declare them extinct or defeated? There's multiple explanations that we come up with, and it depends a little bit, which cultural tradition you're coming in from. From the Spanish cultural tradition, part of the challenge that Lipan Apache power presents to them is to their claims of hegemony, to their claims of control over North America. They're a constant affront to this idea that the Spanish claim to control essentially all the way up into Texas and out into Arizona and New Mexico, when the fact of the matter is that they never really did. That they were tenants on Apache land here. In some way, in fact, the U.S.-Mexico border is an artifact of Apache power, because it's the point where basically Apaches held off the Anglo-Americans coming from the northeast and the Spanish-Mexicans coming from the south. But we look at it from, I guess, the Anglo-American tradition. I do think that this claim that Lipan Apaches in particular, but frankly Texas Indians more generally, it comes from, I think, a position of guilt. And it's very clear in the case of the Lipan Apaches, and I'll explain, or I'll give an example. So in 1842, so this is in the Republic of Texas years, the Lipan Apaches are critical allies of the Republic of Texas. They hold commissions in the Texas Rangers. Multiple ones are colonels, they're captains. Huelgas de Castro actually holds a commission potentially as a general. It's unclear if it's a general or it's a colonel. He was referred to as both at different times. And one of the favorites of Anglo-Texian newspapers at this time is this young captain named Flaco, whose father is also named Flaco. But young Captain Flaco he's a favorite of Texas newspapers. They're always describing him as agile and just the most natural rider, and he's the flower of his tribe, and they follow his exploits. And he's a staple of the Texas Rangers at this time. And there's all these stories in newspapers of him rushing into battle and saving Captain Jack Hayes. And so he's this really kind of dynamic figure that represents an element of Anglo-Texas affection for Lipan Apaches at this point in time. But things start to change. In 1836, even in 1840, even in 1845, Indians are still the vast majority of the population of Texas. But around 1845, around the time of annexation into the United States, that starts to change. And probably for me, at least, the most poignant example of this is the story of young Flaco. So in 1842, after there's a September 1842 invasion of San Antonio, where basically the Mexican Centralist Army comes in and captures San Antonio. There's a few battles up at San Antonio. That army is eventually defeated and starts to retreat south. And again, they're defeated. The Lipan Apaches are right at the front of the army that's defeating them, and then chasing that army back to the Rio Grande. They chase them all the way to Laredo. And by the time they get to Laredo, they've captured a bunch of horses. Well, some of that Texan army ends up going on and marching down to Miera, where there's the Black Bean episode in Miera, but that's not important for this story. But with these captured horses, remember, the Republic of Texas never has any money. They're always broke. And so the way they pay for their expeditions, more often than not, is with horses. They capture horses, they sell horses, they steal horses, whatever it comes to. In this case, they have several hundred horses. The Lipan Apaches in particular were known as horsemen. They were known, by contemporaries to be the most natural horsemen, the most superior horsemen out there. And so it's not a surprise then that this young Lipan captain, Captain Flaco the Younger, he is chosen to take these horses, to lead these horses back to San Antonio, basically, to sell them up there. He never makes it. So that was on January 1st, 1843. He never makes it, and almost immediately they know what's happened. Almost immediately the Republic of Texas government knows what's happened, that he's been murdered. And they go into spin mode. They create stories about Cherokee raiders and Mexican bandits and whatever.
But the whole time, I mean, they even know the names actually of the guys that murdered him. And I wrote them down because I feel like it's kind of important to say it sometime. But there's two guys named Tom Thurman and James B. Rivas. But no charges were ever brought on them. And so we had this incredibly emotional scene where the Republic of Texas, it's President Sam Houston again at this point. Sam Houston sends a guy named Noah Smithwick. Noah Smithwick is a very prominent figure in this period of Texas history because he writes a memoir later on. And Noah Smithwick writes of going to Flacco's father, also named Flacco, and telling him about his son's death. And the quote is, tears rained down the old man's face while sobs fairly shook his frame. One of the images sometimes that we get of Native Americans is this very passive, this very reserved or whatever kind of figure. But that's maybe a bit of a Hollywood construct because I mean all the details here. This is a reaction that I think all of us, any human being, can absolutely relate to. He's so distraught. The father is that he insists on changing his name because his name is the same as his son Flacco's name. He doesn't want to hear that name anymore, so he changes his name. And he also, the Captain Flacco, the older Captain Flacco, he bucks tradition. In some Lipan Apache traditions, they would bury the dead with their belongings, or in some cases even they would kill their horses and bury their horses with them. Well, in this case, he doesn't do that. In fact, he even says, because my son was a friend of the white man, I want to do things the white man way. And so he takes 4 of his son Flacco's favorite horses, and he gifts them. He gives one to Noah Smithwick, one to the commander of the Texas Army, and one to Sam Houston himself. But if you think about it, it's a rebuke. He's sending this as a living reminder of this failed promise of friendship. And it eats at Sam Houston's conscience. Sam Houston actually writes a poem in a sense. I don't know if you guys heard this poem or seen this poem. It's in some ways quite poignant, but I'll read part of it. So this is Sam Houston writing to Flacco the Elder. Quote, "My heart is sad. A dark cloud rests upon your nation. Grief has sounded in your camp. The voice of Flacco is silent. His words are not heard in council. The chief is no more. His life is fled to the Great Spirit. His eyes are closed. His heart no longer leaps at the sight of the buffalo. The voices of your camp are no longer heard to cry, Flacco has returned from the chase. Flacco was a friend to his white brothers. They will not forget him. They'll remember the red warrior. His father will not be forgotten. We will be kind to the Lipans. Grass will not grow on the path between us. Thy brother, Sam Houston." Sadly, of course, we know things don't get better from here, though. This is 1843, and like I said, once 1845 rolls around and annexation, Anglo-Texas doesn't need Indian allies the way it needed them before. In the Republic period and in the Independence period, Anglo-Texans needed Indian allies to navigate the politics of Texas and the Texas Great Plains. But once they have the might of the U.S. Army behind them, the pretense of that kind of disappears. It's actually, even for like a technical reason, even worse than that. So in the United States, Native Americans in theory were protected by an act called the Non-Intercourse Act, which basically it prohibited American citizens from entering Indian lands or federal lands on which Indians lived without a passport, without written permission, and these things. And the idea was that you supposed to create a bit of a buffer. In Texas, there's no federal lands. When Texas enters the Union, it holds on to all of its state lands. And yet at the same time, the federal government has supposedly the sole responsibility, the sole ability to negotiate with sovereign Indian tribes. And so Texas Indians, or native Texas, ends up in this conundrum where Texas Indians are supposed to be negotiating with the federal government, but the federal government has effectively no presence in Texas. And they have no protection from incursions by Texans into their lands, whereas Texans can hide behind the U.S. Army back in their lands on their side of the line. And it sets up this terrible recipe. And so I kind of want to go into this too, is that like the jurisprudence or the legal background of how Native Americans are treated under U.S. law. You guys probably know a lot of this or heard a lot of this, but I think it's worth restating. So, when the United States is founded, 1780, 89, or 87, 89, whatever, the Constitution, it's very clear that Indian nations, Indian peoples are considered sovereign. This is why the federal government is supposedly the only one that has the ability to negotiate with it, because these Indian nations are sovereign nations like France or like England or anything like this. And the other thing I'll say is that the government of the United States in 1789, it's a government of let's just say it plainly, it's a government of the white people of certain areas. It's not a geographic government. The claims of the government are not necessarily to a certain geography, they're over people, over certain people. And at least at the beginning, they don't even have the pretense of pretending to be the government over Native America. But that changes very quickly over the course of the next 20, 30, 40 years. And so most famously, there's a string of Supreme Court cases in like 1830, 31, 32, where they create kind of a new jurisprudence around how the U.S. government is going to view Native America. So first off, they solve the issue of by what right does the U.S. government, as the federal government, claim to have jurisdiction over these tribes with something called the doctrine of discovery. And in Spanish legal tradition, there's a very similar kind of concept. But I mean, put very, very bluntly, it's basically title to the land. The Indians can't hold title to land. Is the short version of it. That basically title goes to the European nation that first discovers it. And there's various theories behind this. And they change depending on when they're being interviewed. Sometimes it's because Indians aren't putting labor into the land. They aren't plowing the soil, which by the way, we later learned is not true, like that they are doing that. And that, for example, the Great Plains may be the artifact of hundreds of years of controlled burns that the Native Americans have been doing to manage the land and do these things. But anyway, so the theories are always very muddled. But based on this doctrine of discovery then, this idea is that, well, then the U.S. government has title, and so these Indian nations, they go from being sovereign nations to being domestic dependent nations. That's the term of art that they use, domestic dependent nations, whose relationship, actually I think these are the words of Justice Marshall, whose relationship to the U.S. government is like the relationship of a parent to its ward, a parent to its child. Well, that's a pretty radical change, but it keeps going too. By 1871, the U.S. Congress basically holds that Indian nations are no longer capable even of making treaties. That no treaties will be recognized, that they're not capable of it, and that in fact the only option, of course, at this point is the reservation or total disappearance, essentially too. Starting to get to some of these things. I mean, and there's speaking of national parks, I mean, there's a complicated legacy here of a lot of the initial lands that are set up into the U.S. national park system were some of the last lands on which Native Americans were living. And so it's the national park system in some ways is a bit of a justification, at least initially, to appropriate some of those lands and to remove Indians from some of those lands. And so anyway, it's complicated like that. But I want to bring this up too, because going back to this idea that the U.S. government claims that it can't really have jurisdiction over Indians because they're their own nation, even though at the same time they're really not recognizing those nations anymore, the gap in this law doesn't get fixed until 1924. Indians cannot be citizens of the United States until 1924. That is 60 years or 59 years after enslaved persons get citizenship. It's 4 years after women's suffrage gets passed, 1924. And around that time too, the policy changes once again. It changes from this policy of moving everyone onto the reservation to a policy of assimilation. But the statistics of assimilation, it's aggressive. This is not consensual assimilation. I mean, the policy of assimilation results in the forcible relocation of 750,000 Native families. Typically, they move them into urban areas to which they had no previous connection. The sterilization of something like 25% of all Native women between 1970 and 1976. The kidnapping of 60,000 Native children into the notorious Indian boarding schools as late as 1973. And of course, in this land of religious freedom, the total prohibition of the practice of Native American religion, which even still to this day, it was 1994 until even the use of the medicine was allowed under U.S. law, and even then it's still unevenly applied. And I mean, some of us know people who have been prosecuted under the shadow of that law as recently as the last few years. So anyway, when we look at history, you have to be careful not to. You can't always take people at face value of what they say. When people write history, they're usually writing apologies for themselves. They're writing defense. They're writing like, isn't it funny how the good guys always win in history, right? Like that's tongue in cheek. I mean, the point being that the winners get to write the histories. And so, what's much harder to do is to try and look for the actual incentives for people in history. And this is getting back to this idea of Native American extinction. Hearing all these things that I've listed here, I mean, that was a strong incentive if you were an Indian to be extinct for the last 100 years or the last 200 years. And I hope it's obvious too that the title Texas Indians are extinct is is not to be taken seriously. But that's what I learned, at least in 7th grade. You know, Texas Indians are extinct except for the Alabama Cushata Reservation, the Kickapoo Reservation, and the Seale Reservation. Those are the ones that are recognized. But other than that, Texas Indians are extinct. That's obviously not true. But there's something special that happens in Texas and in South Texas with Native Americans, with Indians. They become Mexican. And I'm saying Mexican in the way that kind of the Anglo-Texan, Anglo-American caste system of the 20th century uses that term. Because basically before, in the 1900s, the kind of the Eastern American system of race, there was white, and there was black, and there was Indian. And they never quite knew what to do with Mexican. Because, heck, Mexican is a little bit of everything, right? It's a little bit of all three of those things. But we should also point out here, too, that because of the resistance of Apaches and Carrizo Comecrudos and the Coahuiltecans and others in Texas, there were big chunks of Texas, even into 1900, that still did not have Anglo majorities, and still don't to this day. They carved this space for themselves where just by force of sheer numbers, you couldn't implement kind of an Anglo-American style caste system. And so what happens is, if it's 1920, it's a lot better for you to be a Mexican than to be an Indian. If you're a Mexican, you can be a citizen. Maybe a little bit unequal, but you can own land. You can practice religion. You can do all these things that you can't as an Indian. And what I find about this is really ironic, because you may have heard this criticism too. Some of the criticisms of modern Native American groups in Texas in particular is it's a bunch of Mexicans playing Indians. Have y'all heard that before? Have you ever, yeah. You'll see it in articles, you'll see it in whatever. It's a bunch of Mexicans playing Indians. The irony about all of it is what actually may be going on in South Texas is it's a bunch of Indians playing Mexicans, which there's DNA evidence for this too, by the way. This isn't just us, concocting this story. So about 10 years ago, they did a survey of DNA across the United States, of different ethnic groups. They didn't get very granular. I'm sure it would be even more detailed now if they did it. But on average, the DNA of the average person who identified as Hispanic in the United States at that time was 18% Native American. I'm certain in this part of the world it's much higher than that, but that's across the United States, 18%. If you take 18% of the 40% of the Texas population today that identifies as Hispanic, that's basically 7% of the blood walking around Texas today is Native American. In a population of 30 million people, that's 2 million people. Let me compare this to the percentages of people who identify as Irish, 7%, German, 9%, and that's still just barely less than the 12% of Texans who identify or claim to be English. And yet we don't claim that the Irish are extinct, or that the Germans are extinct, or that the English are extinct. Except that they are. In Texas, they are. There's no one walking around in kilts. There's no one walking around in lederhosen. There's no one walking around in powdered wigs. But for some reason, we require of Native Americans a form of ethnic purity that we don't seem to require of anyone else. That if they're not walking around in buckskin fringe every day and wearing a full headdress, that something about that is impure, or that something about that doesn't count. And I guess what I would argue is that, that's a latter-day form of genocide against Native American identity. But by requiring ethnic purity of Native Americans, and I'll point out the real absurdity of it by comparing it to how the legal system treated percentages of African American blood. In the Jim Crow South, you had this concept of the one-drop rule, which was that just one drop of black blood, one black ancestor in your line made you black. Compare that to Native American laws, which require, it's the blood quantum laws, they call them there, which requires a certain minimum percentage, and you have to prove it. The burden of proof is on you to prove to a certain minimum percentage that you are Native American to be entitled to recognition as a Native American. And so the irony is, the burden of proof is entirely opposite, although in both cases they're kind of used to deny people access to rights or benefits or to things like that. But what do you do if you're in South Texas and your ancestors, they never surrendered? They didn't go onto a reservation. Actually, in a sense, they assimilated, which was supposedly the goal. Well, guess what? If you weren't on a reservation, if your ancestors weren't on a reservation around 1900, if you weren't on a roll around 1900, you're not an Indian today under U.S. law, which is just ass backwards if you don't forget my language. But it's like I said, this is why it gets tempting to say, well, no, Texas Indians are extinct, because we can't count the number of pure blood Texas Indians that are walking around on Texas reservations, which there aren't really many of. But it's still false. It's still just clearly, patently false. And I'll point out too, it's also a bit of a legacy of it's consistent with the kind of the deeper, longer, Anglo-American tradition, which has always seen ethnicity as something that's very binary. It's one or the other. And I'll compare it, for example, to again like the Spanish-Mexican tradition. Of course, pure blood Indians disappear into the Mexican population too, but nobody claims they're extinct because everyone knows what happened there. I mean, they come in, they typically, it's mestizaje, it's la raza cósmica, that they write about. It's this mixing that goes on, but it's also, they take on Spanish baptismal names. They have the same names as everyone else. They are living amongst the population here. This is just the way the Spanish-Mexican system is set up, in contrast kind of to the Anglo-American system. And so, I'm trying to figure out how to kind of wrap up these ideas, because they're hard ideas, they're ugly ideas, but I have a strong intuition on how to kind of bring this back full circle, which is that assimilation, even when it's violent, is never a one-way street. That I think, and sometimes too, the things that we deny the most fervently are actually the things that we know are the most true about us. And so that in some ways, I think insisting on Indian extinction may actually be some kind of tacit admission of Native American cultural influence on even modern Anglo-American society today. And here's my favorite kind of proof for this, that all these ideals that we recognize as so American, or in some ways as so Texan, of autonomy, autonomousness, and individuality, and self-reliance, and, well, let's take it further, our legal notions of shared sovereignty, of federalism, of women's suffrage even, those don't come from Europe. They come from Native America. That's where you see them. As soon as we have writings about Native America, we have those ideas all around us. And it's funny too, because Americans and Texans in particular, we often bend over backwards to find ways to defend the idea of our exceptionalism and to look for the roots of that exceptionalism. Typically, we'll look at Europe, we'll look at the Enlightenment, we'll look in Greco-Roman period, which of course has basically no tie to modern Anglo-America. Whereas instead, we're not looking at the very obvious and most likely source of these ideas, the things that actually makes the North American experience different than Europe or than the rest of the world. And it's 500 years of coexistence with Native America, with Native Americans, and with Native American ideals. And so I think that the task of scholars going forward for the next generation is going to be to really tease those things out. The influence, it's not always as overt as a tribe of pure blood Native Americans keeping to themselves and never interacting with other people. That's just not how humanity works. That's not how civilization works. That's not how history moves. But then the evidence is, as I'll point out, no one walks around wearing wigs or lederhosen or kilts. But we sure eat a lot of tamales and tortillas and pozole and chiles, and that's a Native American contribution to modern life. That's where that comes from. And those aren't the only ones. The other ones, like I said, are out there. They're cultural, they're intellectual, they're ideological. And so, with that, I'll stop my prepared comments and see what you guys think about those ideas. Or if you have questions for me.
You made mention about the women's suffrage.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because when we look at Native American history, a lot of the tribes were matrilineal.
Yes.
The Europeans come in and they forced a change on that. And that was especially up in the northeastern part of the U.S., that was a real big struggle for them to change that. And of course, they did change it. A lot of that has completely changed. We're seeing a little bit of, a roundabout going back that way, but initially it was matrilineal.
Sure, and you see evidence of that here too, that change happened. And I'll go back to the Lehman Apaches because they're fresh in my mind. Matrilineal and matrilocal. So they trace their descent matrilineally, and when a couple gets married, the husband goes and lives with the wife's family. And so, this is one of the ideas. Part of the challenge with documenting Lehman Apache history is the European people documenting it, the Spanish, the English, the Anglos, whatever. They have a lot of trouble keeping track of the leadership descent, like who the captains are. The complaint you'll always hear is that they could never make peace with the Lipan Apaches because they could never figure out who to negotiate with. Because basically they'd make peace with one band, and then some members of the band would just break off and go to another band. And like what probably was going on is that they couldn't map out these matrilineal kinship networks. I mean, that seems to be what's going on. And even in the earlier period, so in the 1700s and stuff like this, you actually have capitanas. You have them referencing, women captains, capitanas. You have evidence of them speaking in these councils, speaking in various councils of war, of peace, of all these different things. But by the time you get to 1850, by the time you get to 1850, presumably because they're not being recognized as leaders, and so they tend to imitate the structures, the sociological structures, I guess, of the other cultures around them, the Spanish, the American cultures around them. But it's even worse. In 1856, this is one of the tragedies too of the Lipan Apaches in particular, is even when the U.S. and Mexico are at war, like during the U.S. invasion in 1846, 47, the one thing that Americans and Mexicans can agree on is that Lipan Apaches cannot be tolerated. There's an episode in 1847 where the U.S. Army and the Mexican Army were fighting each other to set aside their differences to go after a Lipan Apache party in Chihuahua. And they killed them, and they had a celebration together afterward. It's the wildest thing. But anyway, so the point being, for this whole period between the 1840s, really until 1900 and beyond, part of the Apache survival strategy is moving back and forth across the border. Well, in the 1850s, they're heavily in Mexico at this point, in northern Mexico. But northern Mexico is going after them too. There's the governor of Nuevo León at the time, that's Santiago Vidaurri. And Vidaurri he's a modernizer, and it's an embarrassment to him that there's still these indios barbaros living out here in Coahuila and these parts, and so he launches an attack on them. And anyway, it's a series of attacks, and you actually have this moment where you have Lipan women are once they're getting captured and they're slitting the throats of their children rather than have them go into slavery. Basically, that was what tended to happen, especially over there around that time. And so, anyway, to your point about this, this is another form of trauma that it's harder to document, harder to trace, but it's a total restructuring of the leadership dynamics of these people. Away from matrilineal, away from matrilocal. It wasn't an acceptable way to intercourse. And so, but again, there's evidence of it, even here locally, of these capitanas, that they just disappeared by the 1800s. And I like this, so I talked about this battle in 1790, the Battle of Soledad Creek. What's amazing about this too is it gets presented as this victory, this breaking point moment for the Lipan Apaches, when actually it's actually maybe some kind of really high point for Lipan Apache power. That there's an alliance that has been pulled together by this Lipan chief known as Picaxande. He gets known also in Spanish, I think, as El Calvo. And also, if he's the same guy, which there's reason to think he might be, he's also referred to as Chief Pascuale in Spanish, which may be like a corruption of Picaxande. But this guy is building on a previous chief before him, and Chief Bigotes was his name, Chief Mustaches, who had put together this multi-generational alliance, basically of Lipan Apaches and Escalero Apaches, that extends its control at one point basically from the Red River all the way to Zacatecas in Mexico, from the Rockies all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. It's this incredible power network amongst what is still a relatively small group of people. I mean, there might be 5,000 to 10,000 people in this entire group. But that touches on something too, is that we tell history in terms of political histories because it's convenient. This guy was the ruler, and then this guy was the ruler, and he controlled this territory, he controlled this territory. But most people in history, like most people now, are just living their lives, right? I mean, so fine, like you're my boss today, like you got a different boss tomorrow. There's hundreds of thousands of other native peoples living in this milieu also, and getting mixed around. And fine, the Apaches are in charge today, the Comanches are in charge tomorrow, the Cumanos the next day. So we have to shake a little bit this idea, and I think it comes from the Anglo-American tradition of wanting to view things as like, no, this is Apache territory, and so it's 100% Apaches right here, and they're ethnically pure. Because where this comes up is when you start doing DNA testing around this stuff. For 1,000 years at least, if not longer, the entire population of the Texas Plains is jumbled around. I mean, they're getting shifted around, they're intermarrying. Even this famous Apache-Comanche rivalry gets overblown a lot. They intermarry. There's all these stories in both traditions of them about to start a fight with each other, and then all of a sudden, like, they see their brother-in-law over there, and like, maybe they fight harder, I don't know, or maybe not, but like, where they don't fight because they recognize, family members. So it's not as clean as a video game, where you have like, this is the red team and this is the blue team, and they're going to go at it with each other. But Big Sunday is an incredible story. Just begin with the range of the empire that he pulled together around this period of 1790, and he as far as we can tell, he dies peaceably. He dies peaceably. It's a peaceful succession of power. It kind of splits up. Cuelgas de Castro is one of the ones who succeeds some of the power. His father Chiquito. There's other ones in other parts. But peaceful successions don't make it in the history books. Don't worry about it. Yes,
I just have a sort of reality check, I guess.
yeah.
Because you mentioned in 1823 after secularization, and before that, we either said we're native or we had to progressively into 1836 Republic of Texas say that we're Mexican.
Yeah.
To protect ourselves.
Yeah.
And just the evidence of our families that lived in the missions up to 1993 there in the mission San Jose. And we have evidence, right?
Yeah.
So how do you justify that when we have evidence that we were named that to now that we've already maybe mixed, or our DNAs didn't really change that much? Only if you married into another family? Did you ever speak to anybody, or did you ever think about speaking to any of the original families that lived there up to 1993?
No, and I didn't. My most recent project, I wasn't covering as much the Mission Indian Descendants group specifically. Although I will point out that the constituency of the missions for 100 years was the Apache, which is another story that gets undersold and whatever. Which again are other great. The missions themselves are molcajetes of mixing. Like where you basically have mixing between tribes, between different peoples. So no, I don't quite know how to answer that. But I think you're hitting on something that is true. That is, if the standard today is still going to be, well, for you to be considered Native American, you have to be 100% Native American. We're perpetuating that same old kind of Anglo-American, system, which is really kind of set up to deny recognition of Native, of indigenous roots and of indigenous continuity. Because it's a complicated thought. Here's a complicated thought for you. I've thought about this. 1 million square miles of U.S. land, basically 28%, 640 million acres, is held today just by the federal government directly. I'm not sure they have the best claim on that land. Again, I've always wondered if you could take a case to the Supreme Court and challenge the doctrine of discovery or something like that. And really open up kind of that issue a little bit more.
One of the things is, we're talking about our people here.
Yeah.
In Texas, but up north, if you live in a reservation, and then they intermarry, and they're maybe 10% native, because they're already intermarried. But here we have, our blood and our history continues. Like, we have to get used to the change of, the priests coming in and out, different ones, and then they have to recognize who we are again. And this happens all the time. Every few years, okay, we've got another priest. Yeah. And then it's a pattern all the way to now, right? So it's like now there's a lot of people saying that they're native, but so I can't tell you that you're native 100% because I'll
Yeah, no, and you hit on something too. So the northern tribes, who really only have exposure to the Anglo system, from the beginning, they're kept apart. That like just Anglo-American society in North Dakota does not mestizaje with Indians. They're always kept apart. That's why they're on the reservations. That's why they're whatever. The advantage for them today, however, is that if they survived, they were on the reservation. They were documented on the federal rolls. They are enrolled American Indians today because of that. And part of my point too is that in this area, because they didn't have to, Native Americans here were able to live lives by identifying as Mexican when they needed to be, or frankly too, being a part of kind of this anti-colonial resistance that existed here in South Texas to these systems. But what it means today is it's like an ongoing way to punish them, to say like, well, because your ancestors never surrendered and were on a roll in 1900, you can't be a Native American. You're not really one. So that's why you end up with these disputes. Is you get a priest that comes in from probably somewhere else in the world. He's used to looking at a nice certificate degree of Indian blood card from somebody, and like that settles it for them. Like, it's just more complicated here. It's a different history here. It's a different story here. It's a different story here, but that doesn't get its extinction. Which I know you're not saying, but I'm saying that. But that's I think how the Anglo-American system would tend to view it, which is not the right way to do it.
It's only because we're Spanish documented.
Yeah, exactly. It's coming from a different cultural tradition.
We had different people doing those surveys.
And then every incentive was to self-identify as Mexican for 100 years. I mean, we have even the sons of the grandsons of Huelgas de Castro, this great chief, survivors of this massacre in 1873 at El Remolino. In 1895, they're still serving in the Texas Rangers, which is a crazy thing. But they're identified as Mexicans. Except like that's an example where we know their exact lineage, and so. Yeah.
We've got some people asking questions
Oh, sure.
on Facebook. One of them wants to know a little bit about your background, your education, and your actual regular background.
Sure. Okay, so I was born in Abilene. Moved here when I was 5. Moved away. Moved back when I was 8. So grew up in South Texas. I've worked for a lot of the last 20 years in Mexico. So I lived in Monterrey for a while. My wife is from Acuña. Still has a place over there that we go to. So I grew up with the standard Texas history books and J. Frank Dobie and all those things. And so when I moved to Mexico when I was 21, I was just enchanted and excited to just find this whole new source of these histories, and really, frankly, to find the source of a lot of Texas identity in those ideas too. I mean, down to the cowboy boots and the beef and the cowboy hats and whatever else, And so, I started this podcast 7-8 years ago, and was kind of trying to do that. Was trying to tell San Antonio's history initially. It's a story of continuity, rather than a story that starts in 1836 or does whatever. Tell it as a story of continuity. At the time, the founding of San Antonio by the Spanish mission friars and going forward. Well, as you keep going further back in Texas history, uncovering, for example, the Tejano roots of Texas identity, you can't help but then start to discover like the native roots of Tejano identity and of other Texas identity too. So it's this draw that keeps drawing you back. But I mean, professionally by day, I've got my undergraduate degrees in philosophy. I've got a law degree and an MBA, and I work in the gas business. I run a gas utility in West Texas now, so supply gas to a bunch of towns out there. So, yeah.
Somebody else said it boils down to oral histories, the authenticity of it, and that's what it is. Mexican mission records like the ones from Guerrero Coahuila corroborate many since Catholics kept real good census.
Yeah. There's something to that, and I've started to kind of advocate for this, that I think that some of the best money we could spend to promote Texas history would be to go digitize some of these archives that are in northern Mexico, even in these little towns like Marin and Victoria, Salinas Victoria, and like you'd be surprised what you find there. Marin is where they found basically the Republic of the Rio Grande Constitution or Articles of Convention, basically. Like there's all these resources down there that hugely inform Texas history that in many cases are not digitized and not available. I mean, that said, the whole reason my podcast is possible now is because for the last 20 or 30 years, you've had a lot of people bringing up a whole bunch of new information, digitizing information, making it publicly available. It's pretty incredible. And groups like yours too, bringing people together. The oral traditions is a big one too. So you guys may also know too that as a part of our podcast, we've been looking for the battlefield of Medina, and so and we've found some battle sites that are consistent with the archival records. But the problem is we haven't found just one. We've found there's actually 4 now that us or other people have found munitions from, and so it makes you go back to the written accounts and realize that written accounts are good, but they're not sacrosanct, and oral traditions too can carry a lot of truth to them also. One of the best examples of this is like some of the rock art, stories of West Texas or South Texas, of other parts of it, that there you have proof of continuity of themes over thousands of years, which is incredible. I mean, did you guys ever play the game of telephone as a kid? Like, you know how hard it is to keep a story going, like just down the road, but these have consistent themes going for thousands and thousands of years. And so there is something to oral history. There is something that you have to give credence. And I mean, that's something too that Western scholars struggle with is they always want to give preference to the written text. There's reasons. Written texts are important. You can't dismiss them. But there's often more to the story, especially when there were strong incentives to suppress the oral traditions or the other written texts. You know? Yes, sir.
It's the word, the Mexican citizen or whatever. Why was it brought up since doing the research and stuff? There's not a Mexican race.
Right.
They're European or indigenous that were born in Mexico.
Right.
And they start calling them Mexicans. But and they, especially the white part of America, kept that so they could use that. For me, I'm thinking it's for something they can use against you. You're just a Mexican.
Yeah. No.
Yes, you just said you're not. But we need to bring it out and say, you know what? There's no Mexican race. We need to call it what it is. Either you're Spanish or Native American. Even though if you were born Spanish over there in Mexico, or Native American, or even people that are white move over there and they're born over there, but they don't want to be called Mexican.
Well, and I really think this does come from in England, in the eastern United States. You know, in the 1800s, there was just this idea that the world was split up very cleanly into different races. You know, that there was, and that everyone was only one race. You know, that this whole idea of mixed race, that was the anomaly. You know, like to call someone mixed race. You know, but the whole world is mixed race in some way, sense, or form. And I don't mean to turn this into like a kumbaya thing or something, but Mexican is a great example of that. You know, where it's centuries of mestizaje. You know, that's of the mixing, and it's why it doesn't. And I guess that's kind of what part of the argument is here, is that a lot of Texas Indian identity, I think, was able to take refuge in Anglo confusion around Mexican ethnic identity. What was that? You know, what is that deal? And so, so the hard part now is like, how do you pull that back out? Or do we even need to disentangle that, or do we just recognize that South Texas identity is largely or significantly Native? You know, I mean, maybe that's part of the answer. It's not as satisfying because what we want to be able to say is, no, there are this many Indians still living in Texas. But again, I think that's playing with this old Eastern United States perspective and construct. It doesn't work for this part of the world, right?
Yeah. I think just the term Mexican is not even the correct word, because the correct word is Mexica, which the Anglo people would say, you know, we're just gonna call them Mexican for short. You know, because they're trying to take away the indigenous identity away from them. So instead of calling them what they were, Mexica, we just call them Mexican, right?
Yeah, but doing my research, and when they wrote the Declaration of Texas Independence, they wrote down that they were against the Mexican government and the Mexican people. Then there were Spanish and Tejanos, some that were recognized as Spanish and Indian. Then after the battle, they sent those guys out of Texas into Mexico because of the word.
And by the way, so if you want to go back to my second to most recent podcast series, was about Jose Francisco Ruiz, who the first senator, Tejano senator, the only Tejano senator at the beginning of the Republic, and then his nephew, Jose Antonio Navarro. And these are some of the really clever fights that they fight to preserve. They can't quite preserve equal treatment, but they're able to preserve, for example, citizenship for Tejanos, not for Indians. They don't have citizenship in the Republic of Texas, which is an irony too, because in Mexico, when it was under Mexico, they weren't technically Mexican citizens, but they kind of lose that in the Republic of Texas. But Yeah, no, I think it's partly the Anglo-American racial model didn't quite know what to do with Mexican. You know? What were you gonna say, Rob?
No, the thing is, our family was born Indians a lot of time, but died as Spaniards. They didn't upgrade a lot of the ways they went out of society.
Yeah.
And so, like, when we were growing up, I would say, well, look, talking about Indians being extinct, I remember distinctly elementary school watching this video. Oh, this is the San Antonio Mission. And the Indians lived there, and they closed them down, and all there were bandits and drifters that lived in those missions. I knew we had always been there.
Yeah.
And so it's like, I go home and I say, well, what are we? And, what happened to the Indians? What are we? And I say, well, so I tell people it's like, my document said I was white, but I wasn't allowed to be white in the 60s.
Yeah.
And so I would say, so are we Mexicans? I've heard this from other people. They would get mad. No, we're not Mexicans.
Yeah.
This is our land.
Yeah.
This is where we're from. We've never come from Mexico. But then he said, what am I? So I'm nothing.
Yeah.
But then later on, they would kind of whisper from the missions. It was like a secret. It wasn't until your father was probably one of the first that tried to reclaim our heritage and that would admit it.
Yeah.
And then Danny was one of the earliest ones in my generation that started admitting, yes, this is who we are.
That's incredible.
So, but we've always known who we are.
Yeah.
We have stories going back to the 1700s.
Right.
When we came up the Spaniards and stuff like that have been given orally. Me and an uncle who's passed away, like the last 40 years, we've been trying to verify oral history with documentation.
Yeah.
So we were able to prove it. Yeah, we rode with the Texas with John Coffey Hayes.
Yeah,
One
exactly.
of my uncles rode with
Yes.
him.
Yeah.
And with Menchaca.
Yeah.
So I had an uncle that died riding with him, or two uncles.
Yeah.
So we were in the Rangers, we were riding.
Right. More than half of the Rangers
There's
initially.
even a
were-
story, and I don't remember who it's about. One of my whatever grandfathers played a card game with Inez Colorados.
It's called the Rats, yeah.
So, and I actually saw just a little blurb, a little article somewhere that mentioned it.
Yeah.
So we have a lot of history, and we've known who we were. And the Mexicans were our enemies, because we fought them at, with the Alamo. We were spies for the people in the
Yeah.
Alamo.
Yeah.
But, yeah, we've always been here, but the thing is, we got title to our land from the Mexicans. And so, you're right, you're saying, well, he's a Mexican citizen, so you're right. It was a lot safer to say, I'm Mexican, because you were a citizen.
That's right. You could at
And
least
you had
have,
title
yeah,
to
exactly.
the land, so
Yeah.
we had that. We still live on some of the land that we
Yeah. But yeah, you see, it's just easier, even as it's patently false, to just say, no, they're extinct now. Right? Because it's complicated. Well, right. That's what I'm taking for that, and it still is. I mean, how do you explain this cleanly, especially in a world of 15-second sound bites? That like to insist on a purity of Native American identity. Maybe that works in some other parts of the United States, but like.
Well, the way I usually approach it is I go to powwows, and it's not like viewers.
Yeah.
People say, well, what tribe are you from? So, well, we don't have a tribe.
Yeah.
I come from a native community that's been there since the 1700s.
I like that phrasing
And
though.
and we're a melting pot of different, our blood, we have probably at least 3 different tribes.
Wow.
We got the local Apaches.
Yeah.
And then, one of my ancestors came from another mission in, Coahuila.
Yeah.
Actually, no, Nuevo Leon. She moved to San Jose in 1785 with her family to help teach them to farm. So, we know a lot. There's some pieces we're still trying to figure out. it, but we'd always come back.
I like that description of it, though. No, I'm part of the native community that, and again, in the case in particular, anything in and around San Antonio has incredibly well documented continuous ties. You know, there's no disputing it. You know, but are you a federally recognized Indian under U.S. law?
No. And it's funny, you know, it's the National Park Service, their video they show, they say, oh, what happened to these? Oh, well, they're living all around us.
Mm-hmm.
We have family living there, so in the mission grounds, it's on heights.
Yeah.
And so,
What I feel like you make sense. I'm uncomfortable. In some ways, if you say that too dismissively, like, no, they're still living amongst us, it's also a little bit of a form of saying they're not really here or something. You know, if it's taken too broadly. I'm not saying you're saying that. I'm saying like that line is used sometimes again as a way of dispersing responsibility or dispersing any notion of obligation. You know.
yeah, but it's just weird. So it's almost like a tacit admission that we exist
Yeah.
beyond a federal government.
Right. But you don't have a card.
But we don't have Indian cards. So yeah, it's like you would say a government, a native community that still exists.
Yes. Yeah.
And you know, we have art.
Yes.
You know, and stories.
Well, and this is slowly occurred to me. You guys probably already had this in your heads, but that the history of San Antonio, certainly up into the late 1800s, San Antonio is an indigenous town. It's not a Spanish town. I mean, obviously there's a Spanish overlay, and eventually they're speaking Spanish, but like, it's an indigenous community. I mean, it's both because of the populations of the missions, but also it's the primary trading point for not just Lima Apaches, but then Comanches and Tawaconis and Caros and Texas and Hasanai. Like, it's that was kind of its role. That was its niche, you know, was as the Texas Plains, North American, you know, indigenous Spanish trading point, I guess.
During my time research on the Alazan Apache, where the mission Indians go.
Yeah.
And so there were two accounts, one in 1700 and the other one was in the 1890s. Well, the city government had allotted them land after they moved them from the mission, or around the mission. They moved them down to the west side of town,
Yeah.
which is all the forts.
Apache Alazan courts.
All the forts, right? So, but then before they gave courts, the city government said, you know what, we're gonna start charging the government, so let's take the land back, and then we'll give them a housing. Because they got tired of them living the way they were living on the street. So how that means we were already identified as native at that time, and those were our people that were there, whether we were Apache or mixed by that time. Okay.
Yeah.
Because our families throughout all the missions, the oldest saying in our history that we were living was our family, our aunts, our uncles, our grandparents would tell us, si vas a ir a la misión San Juan o Espada, cuídate, puede ser parientes, don't go out with someone that's related to you. And it still happened anyway. So that's what I'm saying, you know. So we actually married into each mission more of the time, but some chose to say I'm Mexican or Spanish, unless you really need to use Spanish. Okay?
Yeah.
And identifying yourself with a
Their
tribe.
survival strategy.
Somos indios.
Yeah. Yes.
So Ralph brought a really important point, of course I appreciate that we paid a price to stay free and not be corralled into the reservations. And that's no disrespect to our relatives who aren't in the reservations, but we chose to remain free. But the threat to us, especially here in Texas, was too great to remain free. So that caused a need for assimilation. Now, when this area when the Spanish first came in, you know, all of this was Spanish, and then when they kicked the Spanish out or the Spanish left to go somewhere else, Mexico moved in. This was all Coahuila. So because it was Coahuila, it's almost as bad as when the Spanish were too lazy to give names to the different tribes and just they called them all Coahuiltecans, even though they all were individual tribes. So when we chose to remain and assimilate with the other groups, or to camouflage ourselves, it was really easy for us to just pass off as Mexican, which you're right, is not a race, but it's like people will say, you live in the US, you're American. Well, it's true, we're a bunch of different races, but we are Americans, so that's where the title or the marker of Mexican comes in. So we did remain free, but we paid a price because now it's harder for us to be able to say we're Native American. And our DNA will say something totally different. Our DNA will say, you're absolutely Native American.
Yeah.
But you're right, they're gonna say, where is your card?
Yeah.
Are you on the dog rolls? And we're not. So,
That's
but
why,
it
like,
does not make us any less native
That's
than
right.
those who were in the reservations.
Like I said, the way I said it earlier is, for me anyway, resonates. Like, instead of thinking it as Mexicans playing Indians, you take it back one step behind that. It's actually Indians playing Mexicans, in a lot of cases, but yeah, anyway, no answers today. I guess just ideas or questions.
They had a question.
And
Oh, sorry.
I think that this is why DNA has become so popular and important, especially, within some in the community that never identified as Native before, right? Because your identity was hidden. And you begin to do these DNA tests, and you begin to find your connection to other tribes that are on reservations.
Yeah.
And then, that opens up a whole new world for you that you never knew existed. And I think that's why DNA is so important, especially in the Native community.
I heard of a group out of Mexico called Somos Ancestria that's been doing some really good stuff around it. They seem to have better data sets around Native groups than like some of the big ones, Ancestry.com and 23andMe. But I mean, the other thing too that we have to be careful with a little bit on DNA results is they can still weaponize that against people of Native descent, because they can say, well, you're not pure whatever. Like, well, you think you're Lipan, but you're not really Lipan. This says you're whatever. But it's, the whole idea is people were mixing all over the continent. They weren't static in one place. They weren't just keeping to themselves. Yeah, they married. To your point, somos parientes. Of course, we're going to go marry across the river because we can't all marry each other. And so. Anyway, just the caveat to
Yeah,
not
and
make
you
too
would
much
see
of
it in the Sacramento records, sometimes especially in the early records, right? Because later on the priests got a little lazy and quit identifying what tribe you were from. But you would see, so-and-so de Nacion, whatever, marrying this other person from this other Nacion, So they were already doing that. So of course we were not going to be all one tribe.
Yeah.
Even in the Sacramento records, it's
That's
there.
right. And then the oral legends can be right. Your oral history can be that, yes, we were raised as Cuauhtecans. Your DNA can say that you were Carancagua, and they can both be true. Those aren't contradictory,
Yeah. Yeah.
You gonna say something?
Yeah, I was going to talk about the whole blood quantum thing that you were talking about earlier. Even our family up north, they're, even to this day, they're marrying, having offsprings with other people that are outside the indigenous community. So what makes their offsprings pure and acceptable to be part of their community, and then we can't, and that's what's always, that's something I've been struggling with,
right.
because to me it's not correct.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because a lot of these reservations have blood quantum. And you'll find that as they intermarry, they're having to change their rules a little bit and drop the blood quantum a little bit more. Because what will happen is if they don't do that, then the numbers will begin dwindling within the reservations, and if the numbers dwindle, then the amount they get from the government is even less. So they're changing that.
Sometimes they do the opposite, where they try to get rid of it. Oh, no, you're not in here, that's it.
Yeah.
Because they wanna keep that pot of money.
Sometimes that does happen, Robin, it is because they do want to have a bigger piece of the pie. But I just talked to a couple of people last year that they're actually reducing the amount required because the government will give them less if they have less people within the reservations. So it can work either way.
Well, I feel like I've probably gone on long enough, but I'll hang around for a little bit. Thank you. Well, and Margo and Diane and everyone else that played with this group, just y'all are on the cusp of something really important. This is what we're talking about here. You know, is finding ways to reclaim this identity. And again, I think it's a part not just of your own identity, but of the larger state. You know, that I think with time, with the collection of these stories and stuff, we'll be able to show that.
Before you shut that down, let me ask you one question.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've heard before or not, because you have done the search for Battle of Medina site. In any of the research that you have done, have you found any evidence that there may have been natives that were also participating during the Battle of Medina?
There were 100% natives participating.
Yeah. I heard on Facebook people to be able to hear that.
The Lipanes and the Tonkawas marched out that morning as a part of the tragically ill-fated Battle of Medina, and even before that you had Comanches. And there was even the amazing thing about the Battle of Medina for me is it's this one moment in Texas history where you have an alliance of Mexicanos, almost every native group in the state, Anglo-Americans, all fighting on the same side. You don't really get that again. And so for me, it's fascinating to wonder, what that was. What was it that could bring all of these very different peoples together? I still don't know the answer to it, but yeah, 100%. They are a part of every battle in Texas, really up until the 1860s and even beyond. So
This is how we will behave.
One of the, I guess the biggest things I have that gets under my skin or has gotten under our skin for a long, long time is that, we since you mentioned DNA or DNA, so how that affects our quantum or how much Indian we are. But what about the respect that the people that live there, I always bring this up because some people just don't seem to have an answer for it, or they don't want to say anything, is what about the respect for those people that lived there up to 1993? And what about them? Well, how do you think we feel? The feeling we have that feeling of intrusion still, okay?
Yeah.
But yet, we have assimilated or whatever, put up with it and just kind of let it go because all the government, archdiocese already have, this is the way it is, it's not going to change. Okay?
Three times with faithless.
I certainly don't have an answer.
I had an aunt who passed away years ago, and she knew a lot of our Indian heritage, but she never talked about it. Every time we asked her, she said, no, we're not against it. We're against it. But then we told her children, my cousins, that they were not allowed to talk about it because they were killed back then.
Yeah.
They were just, so she never spoke about it. She wrote some things down, but it's hard to trace. Before she passed away, last year, a cousin of mine and I tried to talk to her, but the children, our cousins, wouldn't be there, wouldn't let us ask her anything about our native heritage. Just how are you and stuff like that. If we tried to do anything, they wouldn't let us talk about it. I wish she had a lot of knowledge.
Yeah.
And there's one aunt that still has a lot of knowledge of it that I've gotten pictures and stuff like that. And talking about
I still want to believe that a lot of probably her traditions and her cultural practices, they may have still been passed through to you in other ways that you didn't know of as native, right? I don't know. I'm speculating, I'm guessing, I'm hoping that that's the case. But anyway.
some of our people that live in the missions that were, like Danny was saying, were put out along the Apache Creek. They were living in Jacalitos, and then they were torn down. I still have some pictures of that. Some of our lived in Jacalitos.
But
And then they were made into the courts.
Yeah.
And they were given housing, but some of them didn't want housing, so they went to another part of the community by Rio, where they had little houses, all little houses like that, and the hot house was right in the middle for everybody to use, the flower. I have those pictures. Yeah, I have those pictures too. It's called Vienna.
And la colonia.
They were all little houses, like in my aunt.
Yeah, my grandmother's.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
my
your You're right, your aunts too. Their uncle and I have pictures, stuff like that.
I think who's really, I think there are people working on this stuff now and documenting this stuff, and I hope there are. Yeah, yes ma'am.
I wanted to mention that, and I'm sure it's like this with everybody else here in this room, when it comes to DNA, when I look at my DNA and my children's and my mother and dad and everything, that the Native American has not decreased. It's, you know how we get one half from our mother, one half from our father. My percentage of Native American DNA is almost as close as what my mother's is. So I didn't get less from her, and I think that's because I have it from my dad and I have it from my mother. And then when my son, his percentage is just as high as mine because of the man I married, because of his Native American DNA. Now with my grandchild, she will probably have half, like maybe 15% or whatever, because of her mother, who's not, has no Native American DNA. So those percentages are pretty much high up there, you know, for a lot of people here in Texas.
That's right. But I mean, you are right too, that over time, they will go down. You know, that's just what's gonna happen. It's all gonna keep getting mixed more and stuff like this. And so that's my fear of making DNA the new yardstick of it, is that, for one, like I said, a lot of people's DNA may suggest, or may tell them they are biologically a part of one group, but they may legitimately have grown up in another group, you know, and have another identity. So I can see how that can be weaponized against people. But also, I mean, too, yeah, it's gonna, I don't want the natural dilution over time to become an excuse to continue to perpetuate the idea of Indian disappearance or something. It's gotta be the opposite somehow, which I think is what you're saying. It's like, you know, we need to leverage it to be a tool of identity, not of disappearance.
But that's based on culture too, though.
Well, a good point.
Because you can be low, very, very low, like, just say some tribes say 10% you're doing qualified.
Yeah.
But you grew up in that culture and that is you.
Right.
Like me, I just recently discovered, not recently, but who my family was. I didn't know what tribe, so I was like a lost child, not knowing where I belong. That was another issue I was struggling with too. But recently I found out I am Weemon. But it was just one of those, like, though I didn't grow up in the culture, am I less native because I didn't grow up in that culture? And to me, the answer would be no. And for me, it's about, okay, reclaiming it and trying to embrace it and bring back what was lost over the years. And to me making that step now puts me even closer to my indigenous roots than I was prior, because now I'm trying to make that reconnection, not just for me, but for my kids, and not just for my kids, for my whole family, so that when I start learning these information, hey, this is what the customs were, this is what our people believed in, this is what we did, then that's going to trickle down to my family, like my cousins and all that, and they'll trickle down to theirs. And I always tell people, as long as it took the generations for my family to forget who we were, that's how long it's going to take over the course for us to remember and start realizing it. You know, it's going to start with me, but then it's going to trickle down. I've had some family members just tell me, like, why are you looking? I mean, we're Tejanos.
Yeah.
Like, it seems like you're trying to figure out who you are, like you don't know your own identity. And it's not that I don't know my own identity, but it's just another half I never knew I had.
Well, I think what you're saying, what you're hitting on is that there's probably multiple right ways to document indigenous identity. Part of which too is changing the notion of, or making sure that Tejano identity, and frankly even Anglo-Texas identity, has a component of indigeneity to it, you know. And now you have to be careful there too, because the other extreme is people with no plausible connection to it, claiming it or trying to hide behind it or something like that. Like no one, but like that's not the case in this geography here. You know, like I mean, like, and so yeah, there's DNA, but there's also how you're raised. There's an oral tradition. There's these other things, and so yeah. Thanks, guys, for letting me come today. So, all right, yeah, my pleasure. So, love what you guys do.
And you know, I want to say this, that I'm glad Brandon was here today, because it brought up a lot of different things that, you know, sometimes in our everyday life we don't think about, right? Because we go around just living our lives. you know, Margo and I were not as fortunate as, you know, Danny and Ralph to grow up in that environment of knowing who we were. You know, even Vicente, you know, we didn't grow up like that. But when we found out, for us it was like, how many other people are out there who don't know who they are? And nobody is reaching out to them and telling them, hey, this is your history. It's not somebody else's history. This is your history. And so, you know, Debbie, you know, Christy, Margo, and I, we made it our life work to let other people know there's this possibility. Do you think there's this possibility? And if you do, let us help you find it. If it's not there, it's not there. But if it is, let us help you find it and let us bring you home.
There's strength in numbers and there's strength in data. And so what y'all are doing is so important for that.
And Brandon, somebody brought up something on Facebook Live, for some of you who are following on there, you'll see that there was this question on there. Someone said, you know, with the DNA, how can there possibly be 15,000 people that are identified as Lipan? That's because for the Native American culture, it was against our culture, our traditions to intermarry within the families. But I say there's two things. One, when it became so unpopular to be Native, a lot of people left their family groups and they camouflage with other groups. And when you lose your connection with your people, this is why your father told you, be careful, because those people over there, Nespada and San Juan, might be related to you. When you move away from your family groups, you lose that. And I would say that there's probably people out there who may have, when they do their DNA, they find that there may be a little bit more connections than what you thought, because you may have married a distant relative because you didn't have somebody telling you anymore, no, don't marry that one because that one is from Seale so-and-so's family or whatever. The other thing is, at least on the Lipan side, I would say that some of it could be, and Ralph, you and Danny could probably talk a little bit more about this and maybe even present it. A lot of people want to say, well, we were Lipanes, so it couldn't be Lipanes, but there's so many different Apache groups, Cadilla, Chiricahua, Mescalero, and a whole boatload. If you followed our post, you'll see there's probably about 20 other different Apache groups. So they may be Apache, but not necessarily a Lipan or Mescalero or Cadilla or any of those. So, don't panic. Yes, you may have married a distant cousin, or maybe not. It was just another Apache from a different group.
They were not allowed, the Apache group, like you said, the word Apache is long, it's big.
Yeah.
There's a lot of branches, like, yes, like Lipan,
Yes.
all those.
Yes.
They were not allowed to marry. So they were allowed to marry in the circle, like Lipan could marry one of the Mescalero, or the Chiricahua could marry one of the Lipanes, but they could not marry out of the circle.
Right.
Keep the blood within the tribe.
To keep them still Apache.
Yeah, that was one of the rules back then.
But when they lost their
But when
connections, and this is why a lot of them married even with the outside of the Native
Right.
American groups.
That's when they were all separated and taken into reservations. Well, they intermarried, there was no other way, but that was back then.
The only thing I have on that is, when about 18 years ago, me and my brother Johnny and my cousin did our DNA. Okay, we're gonna do it. Our dad just passed away, and said, well, we're gonna do what we can and all the stories. But our DNA came out to 98.6. Okay, but then the lady, the doctor said, well, wait a minute. I told him, why can't it be 100? And she said, well, there's a margin of error, right? And then all of a sudden I started getting Ancestry and all these other groups that are doing DNA. I said, okay. So I had to compare it, and it dropped a little bit, right? It dwindled down. I said, well, wait a minute, what's going on here? So I went back and I did another DNA with the same company, and she said, no, we are legit. We are BBB. We do forensics. We find murders and whatever you want to call them, So we got it. So it went down to 82, but it was because they split me up with another group. But see, when we married so that means we married somebody else from another church or mission, they were pure blood, if not more, or less, you know. And on my mom's side, we probably got it from my mom and dad's side, both sides. My mom was from San Juan, her relatives, and then ours were from San Jose. Okay? That's what I'm saying, if there's a margin of error, or they just started saying, you know what, we need to take it away.
And I think some of it also, Danny, is that the more people that do their DNA, those numbers are coming down a little bit. So that happened to ours.
But even I go back to like, even if yours had come back as 46%, to me that doesn't make you a 46% Indian. Culturally, everything about your history and your experience.
It's Indian.
Right, exactly. You know,
That's what
so.
they say, even if you have 1% of Native American Indian, you're Native, that's it.
All right.
Yeah, so, you know,
Just move it on your podcast.
iTunes, Spotify, podcast. You can put in Brandon Seale on it. The podcast is called The New History of Old Texas. Is it on iHeartRadio too? Yeah, it's on all the. Okay, I think it's on all the major podcasting sources now. But so yeah, my name is probably the easiest way to find it. But yeah, I encourage you to start with my latest season, which was the Lipan. It's called Lipan Apocalypse, where I talk about some of these issues and try and uncover some of the history. I don't. No. Well, maybe I can send it out or
I got
something.
one more for you.
Yes, sir.
This is probably one of probably one of the best presentations without a presentation. Okay, and you spoke well about it, and it was, it was pretty spot on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, cool. And now, no problem. You should just-
We want to thank Brandon for coming out and being with us, you know, and sharing this history. If we couldn't have asked for a more knowledgeable person, because we know that he has studied extensively, you know, and he does his best. He doesn't come out here and say, well, somebody told me. When Brandon speaks, it's because he studied it himself. He looked for it himself, and so thank you for being so thorough.
I tried, but again, I have more questions than answers, which is why I thought I'm done, so.
You know, but those questions, I hope that today's presentation led to more questions for you too, to go out and you know, research more. Ask questions of your family.
Yeah.
Because, you know, for us, we grew up thinking we were Españoles. But my grandmother would go out and, you know, if somebody was sick, she'd go and get a little hierbita and, you know, make a tea and, here, drink this, you're gonna feel better. And we did. The Spanish didn't do that.
I want Brandon, before you leave, to tell y'all about the exhibit he has over at the Whitty.
Real quick, we have an exhibit that we're now around our Battle of Medina searches and some of the results and some of the munitions and stuff we found. So if you go to the Whitty Museum, it's over in the South Texas Heritage Center. There's a nice room we did this with a veterans group, American Veterans Archaeological Recovery. We're not done, and we're still doing work on it, but yeah, there's a nice little exhibit there and a nice timeline of events talking about the first Texas War of Independence and those things.
Awesome.
Thanks, guys.
Thank y'all so much for coming out. We still have a little bit of pastries. We have some coffee. Please take some and be ready for next month. For those of you who are still doing research, bring your laptops next month. Bring your writing utensils. We're going to have an awesome presenter that has been doing research and in Native American ancestry. So
She's gonna help you with your trees, how to get started on your.
show you what you need to do, how to connect things. Okay?
But let's
So-
give Brandon another round of applause.
And if y'all need, you know, if y'all have any other questions, you know, when you get home and you think about it, let us know so we can get a hold of Brandon and ask.
I'm on Facebook.